Hello, I'm Katie and this is Stepmum Space, the judgment-free zone where we'll talk candidly about the fairy tales and scary tales of stepmum life. So whether you've been a stepmum for years, you're just starting out, or you want to understand the stepmum in your life a little bit better, this is the place for you. My guest today is none other than the brilliant Dr. Maryhan. Dr. Maryhan is a psychologist, parenting expert, host of the fantastic podcast How Not to Screw Up Your Kids, as well as being a mum and stepmum herself. Before we recorded this, I put a shout out to you guys on Instagram for some questions, and in this episode we cover a lot of ground. From how to manage different expectations between houses, to whether you should call out bio mum's lies about you to your stepkids, to what to do if you don't actually even like your stepkids. Yes, we are going there with all the uncomfortable conversations, because I truly believe it's only by having these conversations that we can start helping people. There's a lot to unpack here. It's a slightly longer episode than normal, so sit back or go on a manic cleaning mission like I do when I listen to a podcast, and enjoy the show. Welcome, Dr. Maryhan. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I've been so excited to talk to you. I love your show, and it's great to, listen in with my mum hat on and my stepmum hat on to see kind of how I can be supporting the children in my life a bit better. Obviously, there are some big differences between raising your own children and trying to raise or stay on the right side of raising somebody else's children. And one of the things I'm really interested in understanding a bit is sometimes people talk about how divorce is really harmful for children. As a sort of parenting expert, what's your view on that?
I think a lot of it is based on how it's handled. It really ultimately, I think I read some data, you'll know better than I will, but I thought I read some data the other day that said 40% of marriages end in divorce. And it's becoming more and more prevalent. And for me, the outcome for your children and also for you in terms of your well-being is all to do with how it's handled. Because there are many marriages that are very unhappy marriages that are more damaging than a divorce.
Yeah, and that's the thing, isn't it? Because you always read things that say children fare better in together families, but the families that stay together are happy, and the families that split up maybe were not. But there's no comparison around, well, what would it have been like if you'd have stayed in that marriage? And arguably, as you were saying, even worse for the child.
Well, there's so many people who stay, I talk about this a lot. This notion of staying together for the sake of the children is so much more damaging. It's not that I'm encouraging people to split up, but ultimately, we know when things are not working. And actually, it is far better for all concerned if we've tried everything and it really is not working, that we make that decision, rather than what I see so often. Let's stay with the children, stay together until the children are 18, or they've left home, or they've gone to university, or they've got their jobs. But the reality with those situations is the children then reflect back on their childhood and they wonder how much of it was actually real. If my parents have been unhappy, but they've stayed together for us, how much of those last however many years where things have been difficult were really true? And actually, I think that can be more damaging. So I think, yes, divorce can impact children, particularly when it's not handled particularly well. And there's lots of animosity and children are stuck in the middle. But children can be equally stuck in the middle in what's seen as a long, happy marriage.
Absolutely. I know from my side, I kind of look at my son from my first marriage and I think, okay, his parents aren't together. And I know there are still things that he finds hard about that. And, we separated when he was young. He's 12 now. But I also know he gets to live in two homes with two happy relationships. His dad's with someone else, I'm with someone else, and he has 4 grown-ups who he likes and respects and who really care about him. So I do think for sort of the women who are listening, there is always an awful stigma in a step family, almost like the poor child, the poor stepchild that is the victim of all of this, which somehow feeds into, some of our wicked stepmom narrative. So, look, I've got a lot of questions from people who listen to the show. And while I've got you, the expert, the fountain of all things children and parenting, there's some things I really would love to talk to you about. So, one thing that comes up a lot with women I talk to is sort of different expectations of two homes and whether children can navigate between that and how we can support them to do that. So, for example, it might be that in one home you're allowed on social media and in another home you're not. I'm talking about kind of, the 11, 12-year-olds. What's your sort of view on that?
I think in an ideal world, as parents who've split up, that you would have similar values around the big things. Such as, as they're getting to that age of having boyfriends or girlfriends, what do we feel about them staying over? Some of the big stuff, maybe, school and other things. However, that isn't always going to be the case, because ultimately, fundamentally, you are different people. And whilst you might, when you were together, have negotiated things, you've now added the dynamics of two other people and their expectations. So I think it's much better to just be open and upfront with children, because children can manage this on that basis of, in this home, these are it's not even values, but they are basically underpinned by values. But in this home, this is how we do things. Mm-hmm. And when you're at your dad's or when you're at your mum's, they have different rules. And therefore, it's that moving with each of those. And I also think we have to accept that as a consequence of that, you're going to have potentially a little bit of favoritism. Well, I love going to my daddy's, because my daddy's, I'm allowed to take my phone upstairs to my bedroom and I can be on it all night and I don't have to hand it in. And I think we have to be the bigger person with that. Children ultimately see us for who we really are. And as I've said, I'm divorced. I have stepchildren. My children's father has not met anyone else, but that was one of the biggest challenges, was the fact that there were very, very different rules. But ultimately, we mustn't forget our role as parents. And if we fundamentally believe that our children shouldn't have social media, or they shouldn't have their phones in their bedroom, or they have to sit at the table to eat, whatever those things are, then fundamentally that is our role as a parent. And if they don't like us, and they may not like us for quite a period of time, then we have to be assured that we're doing the right thing. So I think children can adapt. I think we have to be honest that we're going to get a little bit of favoritism, and potentially children who want to spend more in the home that is more liberal, but no, ultimately the children respect being told what is in their best interests, rather than sometimes what can just be easy for popularity.
And I think, a lot of the time when parents have separated, you see a bit of permissive parenting, often on dad's side, but it can be on mum's side as well, in terms of, you're so desperate for your child to be happy when they're with you, you'll almost do anything, and you forget that actually boundaries are often really helpful for children. What about, and I hear this a lot, when parents have split up, dad's met somebody else, but when the stepchildren are there, dad kind of becomes a bit Disney dad, lets things slide that he wouldn't normally because he doesn't see his children very often. Do you think that can actually have a negative effect on children, or do you sort of think actually that's okay, they're not with their dad so much?
No, I think it can, because first of all, it creates a them and me. It's so much more fun at dad's. I'd rather go to dad's more often. But I also think it creates a false narrative for children around what spending time with a parent looks like. And potentially this notion that actually it's all about doing fun things and being bought things. And potentially that this is, if that's the only way that they see love being expressed to them, it's creating the wrong model. How we behave with our children creates a model to them of what a relationship is, what love is, and it creates a blueprint. And that blueprint is what they take into their adult life. If they feel that their needs are being met emotionally, then that's great. Their future relationships are good and positive. If they believe their emotional needs are not met because actually they're not really connecting at any deep level, they're not really being able to talk about how they're feeling and having that met, and instead it's all Disney, then whilst at the surface level, which child isn't going to love that, being bought things and being taken places? But actually, what does that do in terms of foster that connection And that can then have an impact in terms of the difference between gender. So if you've got a girl visiting her father, is this the way that men show love? Is this how relationships look? Is that what I'm going to actively pursue when I'm older? Those are the sorts of things. I think, I'm not trying to worry people unnecessarily, but I do think those early years and how we're raised have such a profound impact. If we just think of ourselves as adults, how much do we reflect back on how we were treated as children and those things, and what belief systems that would have brought us in terms of money, in terms of time, commitment, relationships, education. They all came from our experiences as children.
And that is so true. And I mean, I've had a bit of therapy in my time, and I was talking to somebody the other day, and one of the things that I was told as a child, with full good intention from my parents, was, as long as you've done your best, that's good enough. Like, don't worry, as long as you've done your best, that's good enough. So I've worked out, I've spent my whole life trying to do my best at everything. So, because that's just what I grew up with. And, my partner said to me the other day, is that like why you try so hard at everything? You never give yourself a break. And I'm like, it's really important to do your best, right? And it's never occurred to me, well, do you know what? Maybe for that meeting or that presentation at work, maybe good enough is good enough. And it's funny because you think, actually, I remember as a child not feeling put under pressure by my parents and actually finding that quite helpful. But everything has an impact one way or the other, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, massively. It's all of that, and it feeds through. If you remember one thing from the whole conversation, children are much more likely to do what they see than what we say. Every aspect of our behaviour models to our children. So if we're trying to get our children to encourage them to be more responsible, if we're trying to take them to take risks, to be more confident, to push themselves out of their comfort zone, and we throw our hands up in despair at every moment that we find ourselves in something difficult, we don't dig in when the tech doesn't work. I mean, tech is my nemesis. But then what are we teaching our children? Actually, I'm telling you to put yourself in difficult situations and try and do things. But actually what you're seeing me doing is staying in this tiny little confines of this little square that I'm not prepared to push myself out of.
Interesting. I know there'll be lots of women listening who will be very pleased to hear that children can kind of cope with two different sets of, let's call them, boundaries. How do you manage a situation whereby, say, for example, you have the children 50% of the time, and I hear from a lot of stepmums that, manners matter to them, table manners matter to them, and they kind of get to a point where things are going well, stepchildren are using knife and fork, not putting their feet on the table, etc., etc. Then they go back to mums, and then they come back to stepmum's house a few days later, and it's sort of back to square one.
I think part of that is almost having a bit of a reset routine, because you see this as well, particularly with children who might be transitioning between houses, and there's often a bit of fallout. So I do think having some sort of just general reset routine, and you can have a conversation. I don't think we should worry about having those conversations. So I'm a big fan of having sort of family meetings, nothing formal, no minutes, but just a check-in. Look, remember, we have different rules in different houses. We're back to here. Can we just, and almost restating, instead of you restating, ask the children to restate. What are the rules that we have around meal times? What's really important to us, so that you almost get them to do that check-in transition. Now, that might not be the minute they walk in the door. It might be that we have to manage our own expectations that, okay, right, I know for the first half a day, hour, 2 hours a day, I need to manage my expectations that we're going to have a bit of that as they transition. But then we're going to have some way of reconnecting and reminding, okay, we're back here now.
Yeah.
For our expectations at meal times.
How much of a say do you think stepchildren in a family should have around the rules, for want of a better word, within that home? Because generally in a first family, the parents will set the expectations and the children will be expected to comply with them. But quite often in step families, children have a lot more power. Do you think that's a helpful thing or not?
My personal belief is actually that as parents, as our children, basically when our children are younger, we tend to have this dynamic, this slight power dynamic. I'm the parent, I'm the authority figure, you're the child. As children grow up, I think we have to shift that dynamic to much more adult. Now, I don't mean that means we allow our children to decide what they do, but I do think that where we encourage our children to have choices and to then manage the consequences of those choices, I think that's much more empowering than constantly going head to head with kids. So what you do is you give them choices within parameters. So if for you, bedtime is 8 o'clock, okay, that's a given, that's the boundary. But what you might do is give them some sort of independence of choice around the sequence of what happens before bedtime. So you know that maybe a bath needs to have, they have to have tea, they have to eat, all these sorts of things. Now, they don't get to choose what time you eat, because obviously for a whole family you're doing that. But we might give them a bit of independence around the sequence of things.
Yeah, I love the idea of finding some way for people to contribute and feel like it's their environment that they've created as well, but obviously like within those parameters. You know, I was thinking when you were talking, my eldest biological son is 12, and most of the time now I could probably go to bed before he's ready to go to bed, but I will say to him now, I think you should go to bed now because I think you'll be a bit tired and you won't feel as happy in the morning. But if you want to stay and watch the rest of your program, you can. And more often than not, he'll say, do you know what? I think you're right. I think I should go to bed. And it is that sort of give a little bit of choice so you don't always feel told to.
And it makes such a difference as they get older, because being able to, that, you know, what you're doing is you're treating them in a more adult-like way. And what happens is they get to choose, but they also get to experience the consequence. And I don't mean that in a punitive way. If he stays up and watches the program and it's late, he notices the next day how tired he is, how much he struggles to get up. And that's so much more powerful in him choosing next time than us saying, no, switch it off, go upstairs, you're going to be tired. And he's going, I'm not going to be tired, I'll be absolutely fine. So they don't learn.
So something you touched on then that was really interesting around sort of how we treat biological children and stepchildren. And this is like a minefield. So generally the advice that is given is treat all the kids the same. That can be quite difficult, not only because, you know, there might be different ages or different types of humans. I don't necessarily think you should treat all children the same anyway. Where do you sort of sit on that in terms of expectations of stepchildren versus children that might be in the home full time?
I think that you can't treat any child the same, whether whether you've got 4 biological children or whether you've got 2 biological and 2 stepchildren, because the fundamental reality is that you know every aspect of the process that your biological children have gone through. You don't know that situation for your stepchildren. So how can you treat them the same? I think it has to be tempered with love and wanting to do the best for them, but understanding that you cannot, you know, and you just, there's so much wrapped up around that. I think it's a false narrative, because what that then does is it makes you feel absolutely crap about the way that you might feel when you're managing those particular situations. So no, I don't think any child should be treated the same, because they inherently have different personalities, different drivers, different motivators. And I think with stepchildren, we have to be mindful of the fact that they're being, most often than not, being co-parented in another situation. Obviously it's different if there's been a bereavement, but that fundamentally, while we have them in our home and we're being that step parent, that we have to approach things differently, definitely.
And do you think it makes a difference in a step family home who enforces expectations of children? So like really simple scenario, vegetables, rightly or wrongly, I'm not you've got to eat everything on your plate parent, but I will look at my daughter's plate and say to her, you know, you can leave the potato, but you need to finish the rest of the vegetables. Sometimes situations like that can be quite tricky with stepchildren when it's the step parent telling them. Do you think step parents should leave that type of thing to the biological parent if it's possible?
For me, it's about taking an approach of sort of, you know, what are we trying to teach our children? Yeah, ultimately our role as parents is we're custodians, whether we're a parent or a step parent, we're custodians of these children until they reach adulthood. So our role is to instruct, teach, and help them come out the other end as adults who can be happy, form good relationships, and ultimately hold down a job. So everything that we do has to come back to, am I helping them with that? So that's why I tend to approach this notion of the world is full of consequences. Yeah, positive consequences when we help somebody, negative consequences when we don't show up to give a presentation. So it's consequences that we need to be talking about and helping our children with. So I think that there are some aspects of consequences and behaviour that are just as much for us to instruct as step parents as it is for biological parents. But I do think we've got some context, we know. So if we've got a child, let's say, who their biological parents basically don't touch a vegetable at all, that's a context that we have to deal with. So suddenly insisting that they eat 2 or 3 vegetables at a meal is going to create a standoff. So we must adapt and we must mold. And then that becomes a discussion around, it's really important that we nourish our bodies. And part of nourishing our bodies is not just these sorts of bits, but it's also vegetables. While you're here, it's really important that you just try. And so that's the conversation you're having with your stepchild, but you're having a separate conversation with your children to say, I know that it must feel that there's different rules, but it's helping our children understand the complexities of the situation, and that sometimes, as is the case in a workplace, we may choose to make different demands on one set of employees to another. So it's being able to then also manage that. I know it sounds incredibly complicated. It's not, but it's helping our biological children see the difference, but also being respectful to the stepchild of what we know is happening in the other house, that it's a step potentially too far.
Yeah, and I love that idea of explaining to them why. And I think at, whatever stage of their development they're old enough to understand it, it works really well to sort of almost have that honest conversation with your biological kids. You've actually reminded me of something I was talking to a stepmum about this morning, which was her stepchildren are with them 50-50, 2 boys, and she has 2 younger biological children with her husband. And her stepchildren are, she was saying to me, they're really violent with each other. They're fighty. And she doesn't like that. We're not talking about a bit of rough and tumble play. It's proper kind of punching each other. And they're trying to get them out of that habit. And she sort of said, we manage it. And then they go back to their mums and it starts again. But the point of my question is, she is really worried that her younger boys will see that behavior, model that behavior, think that that's okay. And she was saying to me, it makes me really resent them coming. What can we learn about how our younger children respond to what they see from their older siblings?
Yeah, I mean, her concerns are legitimate, because obviously that in lots of ways, and particularly if they're same gender, and you see this a lot. So I think definitely trying to temper that is really key. And one of the ways that you can kind of deal with it, in that this is the way that we do things here, a real great positive way of doing it is when you absolutely catch those moments where they're not, where they're interacting in a less way, like heap on the praise majorly. So in those moments, and it's called descriptive praise. It's this notion of say what you see, the whole catchphrase thing. Oh my goodness, it was so wonderful seeing you do X, Y, and Z, because all children love praise. So praising them when you see the great, even if it's not immediately exactly as you would like it to be, but by praising that, they feel great. But also by praising that, you're inadvertently communicating to all the children in the house what the desirable behavior is and labeling it. And then I'm a big fan of random treats and random praise. So you might choose, if you've had a particularly good day, and a good day may be that they haven't been it's not that they've stopped being physical, but actually relative to normal, there's been a significant drop. Yeah. You might then say, do you know what, you two have been so incredible at playing together in this kind of way, or doing this together. We're going to do popcorn and an extra episode of your favorite television program tonight. Doesn't have to be buy them anything. Kids value that sort of stuff. Yeah. So this is what we want, but also doing it the other way with the praise.
That's super helpful. Thank you. Obviously, in an ideal situation, we'd all have incredibly amicable divorces, separations, and be able to communicate really well with our exes. In reality, that isn't always the case. And sometimes I know stepmums can feel like a lot of what goes on in their house is dictated by somebody externally. And it can be quite difficult when a stepchild is in the house saying, well, my mum says this, my mum says that, my mum says the other. I had a question from somebody who said, to what extent should you correct lies that are told about you to the stepchild? So a stepchild comes into your house and says, well, my mum said this. How do you handle that while still trying to be respectful to the fact it's their mum?
One way of approaching it is, don't forget that that's the reality that the child has. And actually, don't children always do that, even whether it's stepmums or something, or they're going to school and say, well, my mummy says.
Yeah.
I think my general tendency would be to acknowledge how the child has said it, and where possible, almost come back with is almost expand on it. So the expansion has an element of correction in there. So you don't correct the actual thing they're saying. You acknowledge, oh, it's interesting that you said that, oh, that I am a whatever. And then you add another little piece that is more truthful. So you're acknowledging how that child's seen the reality that they've been given, but you add a little extra. In the same way as when children are learning to speak, we might say, and they pronounce something incorrectly or they label something incorrectly, we paraphrase what they've said, but we then, rather than correcting them, saying, no, that's not a duck, that's a truck. Instead, we say, oh, that's interesting, you're pointing at the duck. That's a really big truck, isn't it? So in some ways, we acknowledge what they've said, and we then, so it's not a correction, it's an acknowledgement, but then we add a more truthful narrative in there.
And I've heard a lot of women sort of saying recently, this can happen with money. So, oh, well, you can't go on your school trip because daddy hasn't paid for it. And actually daddy might have paid for it. In that situation, it's so difficult because by telling them the truth, you're basically saying your mum's lying.
Yeah. And that is I think in some of those sort of situations, particularly when it's at that level, you can't go on the school trip, you're in a really sticky ground, because in lots of ways you're probably paying for whatever reasons that it's come out. I do think when those sorts of things happen, regardless of the relationship that you have with the other party, I think it's important that if it's the dad must have that conversation with their ex and says that this is what we're getting, and we both know that this is not a helpful situation for our children to find themselves in, and almost preemptively, I'm going to need to have a sit down and have a discussion with them should this continue, because what's happening with that is it's creating a narrative that they're not providing.
Yeah, I can think of examples where my mum says you shouldn't have bought Stacey that ring because you should be spending your money on us, those types of things. And that's then really difficult because the child's being put in a situation by the biological parent where the biological parent is suffering because of the step parent. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I mean, I think in those situations you can acknowledge, I can see how you might think, but trust that there's enough money to go for everybody, or something along those lines that kind of helps them understand that it's not because of this you're not having that is, particularly where there's been an arrangement made financially and that arrangement's being honoured. What they then do with the rest of their money is completely entirely up to them. But there's obviously that resentment and that anger. And I think in lots of ways, children need to understand that there is enough to go around. But part of it is also being mindful that you don't want to be part of the ping pong situation that a child feels that they're constantly being in. So it's weighing up in that moment. Okay, yes. And as parents, of course, we want the truth to prevail. It's like, if we're being seen as the bad person, it's like, that's so far stretched from the truth. And sometimes being the bigger person is simply saying, do you know what? I'm not even going to enter into this. But what I will say, and if it's any reassurance at all, children start off when they're little. You think about your own biological children and they idolize us. We're gods. We can never do any wrong. We're perfect. We're wonderful. Everything is like my mummy said, my daddy said. As they get older, they see us for every single flaw that we have. So know that if you are in that current situation where there is this conflict and you are choosing to be the bigger person and not retaliate, that child is painfully aware and is becoming more aware as they get older. And whilst Disney dad, holiday dad might be seen as this wonderful person, over time, when you're doing the right things, when you're trying to do all of the things in terms of raising this wonderful adult, children do see that. They might not thank you for it now, but they absolutely will do later.
And that's so important for dads to hear. So dads to know, yes, your child might not be with you all the time anymore. You might not see them every day anymore, but that doesn't mean that you have to be all about bubbles, glitter, and McDonald's.
No, because children value those things. Whilst we often feel children don't necessarily want boundaries, but it helps them understand the parameters that they live within, and it helps them understand when they're doing a great job. And that, I think, is so key, because what they take from that into their normal day-to-day with their friends and negotiating is what's much more fundamentally important. Parenting is a tough job. Parenting requires us to say no, probably more often than it requires us to say yes. Parenting does involve all of the ugly, messy, I hate you, you're so mean. But to be honest, when you're getting that, you're doing a brilliant job.
Well, that is reassuring. Brilliant to hear that if a child tells you they hate you, you're doing a good job. And my 4 and 5-year-old obviously think I'm amazing. Because, it's so funny when you were talking about children idolizing you, because I was walking them to school this morning and they were going, "Mummy, you're just so beautiful. You're so beautiful." And literally 20 minutes before at home, they were going, "We don't like Mummy, we just like Daddy." I'm like, I can't keep up. But in those moments when a stepchild might say to you, "I hate you," or, the classic, "You're not my mum," how should you respond?
I would get you to respond in exactly the same way as that you would if you were a parent. So respond to the emotion behind the behavior. Yeah, I get that you're really annoyed with me because I've said you can't do X. I get that you're angry or upset, or you think I'm being mean. Whatever it is, acknowledge the emotion. And I would say, particularly with stepchildren in that moment, acknowledge it and come away from it, and just say, maybe later we'll have a chat about how we might be able to manage this a bit better next time. And by manage it, it's both of you as such, because we have to validate how they feel. What they're basically saying is, I'm unhappy about this particular situation. I found this difficult. So rather than dealing with actually they're just being rude to me as a stepmom, there's some raw feelings behind that. And by acknowledging it and validating it, you're opening up a dialogue with them.
That's so important, because there is a difference I know there's a huge myriad of different stepmoms listening. Some have their stepchildren 100% of the time. Some have them 50-50. Some have them every other weekend. Some only see them in the holidays, whatever it might be. But generally, it feels, for me anyway, it certainly feels less hurtful to hear something from my biological child than a stepchild, because it's almost like my stepchildren, if they say something, I think it sort of confirms all those things that I'm worried about. So I think it's really helpful to hear you say, actually, that's about that emotion and how you respond to that. I think a lot of stepmoms find that really hard, because it does hit them in that really raw place, which every stepmom is worried my stepkids don't like me.
Yeah. And I think that's why, if you can just acknowledge and validate it in the moment and say that you'll go back to it another time, not in a punitive way, but just maybe let's have a chat about this later, it allows you to come away from it without acting from that absolutely visceral, oh my goodness me, like the dagger in your heart, and then potentially trying to overcompensate or do something that you're trying to make good, because ultimately that might be something that they've said because they know it's going to have the desired effect of, I'm really pissed off with you, so I'm going to say this. But more often than not, they don't actually mean that. They're just angry.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? And I think a lot of women, myself included, sort of read into way more with stepchildren than you do your biological children, because of everything that sort of comes with trying to get to know and support somebody else's child, I guess they are, when they first come to you. Something we talked about with somebody else on the show was about when you feel like actually, and this is quite a difficult one for a lot of people to talk about, when you feel like actually you don't really like these children, you know, you've picked your partner. And the weird thing often happens with step parenting is you'll say, well, we're not going to meet the children until we're in a really serious relationship and we know that we're committed. But by that point, like you're into this relationship. That's the person you want to be with. If you then meet their kids and you're like, oh, like the love of my life's told me little Jimmy and Johnny are absolute darlings, but I can't stand Jimmy and Johnny. What do you do? Like, do you walk away then, or do you try and build the relationship? How would you advise someone to navigate that?
I think it's difficult. I think ultimately it's about the relationship that you have with the adult and the workability of that, because obviously children are a product of two parents that have raised them together. And sometimes it can be that actually, do you know what? The kid's behaving like that is a massive warning sign. Get out while you still can.
Yeah.
That can be the case, but it isn't always the case, because they've been a product of two parents. You know, if you've had one partner that's been absent a lot and just by work virtues and other things, and just, you know, cultural differences and differences in the way that they view parenting. But what I would say, and you know, whether that's to give people permission or whether that's just a reality, is we won't always like our stepchildren, and that's okay. We don't have to. The commitment to the relationship is to that person that we're having a relationship with, a romantic relationship. It isn't with the stepchildren. So if we don't like the stepchildren, then that's okay. It's understanding that it's okay not to like them. It isn't our role to shape and mold them, but it is our role and our responsibility to do as best we can in terms of creating an environment that is loving, but is also one that models the reality of the world. So if you have specific values within that house, that when they spend time with you, then uphold those, but you don't necessarily need to like the children. You know, I think it goes back to that whole narrative of what we see on television. You know, we've got this ideal, because we don't like them, do we then put ourselves in this, oh my goodness me, I am that wicked stepmom because I don't like my stepchildren. And we're caught in this sort of, well, it's supposed to be this perfect, wonderful thing, and I'm supposed to love them almost like my own. And it doesn't have to be the case. In the same way as there's sometimes moments, and lots of moments, where we don't actually like our own children at times. Doesn't mean we're bad parents. I just think it's reminding ourselves, and also that children, in the same way as adults, we change and we develop. They may be at a particular point in that they're not as likable, but that doesn't mean that that's going to be dictate the whole course of our relationship with them. That may well change over time.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I'm in my 40s. I've got lots of friends who are very close to their stepmums now, but will say, oh, I gave her hell when I was younger. And as they've grown into adulthood, they're close with them. So I think it is important, like you say, to remember that it ebbs and flows. But I think there'll be a lot of people listening feeling like they've had a massive weight taken off their shoulder by feeling or being told by somebody with so much experience and so well qualified, do you know what, if you don't like your stepkids, that's okay.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. And it's just about always acting from a place of, am I as an individual am I acting with my own integrity, my own authenticity? Am I being truly me in a kind and compassionate way? And if I am, and I don't like them, then that's okay. Might stay that way forever, but it may ebb and flow and it may change, and it usually does.
And on that, and I mean, I guess this isn't unique to step families, but how do you sort of separate the feelings about the child from the feelings about the behavior? So I'll talk to a lot of women who say it feels very stressful when they've got their stepchildren, but a lot of the time when you unpick it and you talk to them more, actually it's not about that child, it's about everything that comes with them. So the complexity around schedules, the last minute change of plans, all of that. So how do you try and separate that in your own mind?
It is difficult, and I think you just have to keep reminding yourself, because I think a lot of it is also how you build up that expectation. And it's this notion that, so as human beings, we can't process all the information that is around us. We just simply can't. There's just too much of it. So we selectively choose.
Now you tell me.
No. We can't. We can't possibly. That's where stereotypes come in. That's where biases come in.
Yeah.
We simply cannot attend to everything. So what we tend to do is we tend to notice certain things. And the internal narrative and the internal chatter that we have with ourselves is so powerful in determining our experience of things. So it's actually, a lot of the work can be done even before you've got your stepchildren for that period of time. It's like, what am I telling myself? Because so often it's in the build-up, isn't it? It's like, oh my goodness, they're coming and I'm going to have to juggle this, and I've got this, and they always behave like this. And I'm not just saying that about step parents. How many of us in the pit of our stomach who are working parents and then think, oh my God, the summer holidays, how am I going to manage? So we've already built it up. So what then happens is when we're in the midst of it, we've almost primed our brain to notice all of the challenging things, and all the lovely little wonderful bits we completely miss because we're so primed for that. So a lot of the work can be actually done in the preparation. What's showing up for me? Why am I already noticing a bit of a pit in my stomach? Why am I finding myself getting stressed, trying to organize a multitude of things that I really don't need to? How can I better manage this? And it's a work in progress. It won't happen overnight, but it's being able to recognize, what am I doing in the contribution of the build-up that I can try and let go a bit more of? Do I need to go for a walk with a friend because I know that I'm in that state and I just need to get it out rather than holding on to it?
Yeah, and a lot of the time that's where the kind of gender biases come in, and like the stepmom tries to arrange lovely things for the children to do on the weekend or whatever it might be, but actually, come on, dad, like, you created these kids, you step up and think of something nice for them to do and get some shopping in and food they like, etc.
Yeah, exactly. And why not have a conversation with the children when you've got them to say, look, you come to us every other weekend, it would be great to know what are the sorts of things that you'd like to do when you come here. What are some of the things you'd like us to eat? What are some of the things that you like to do? Let's do a big wish list. Now, I can't promise that we'll be able to do all of them, and I don't know which order of them, but we'll try as best we can, but also recognize that there'll be some weekends we do nothing.
Yeah.
Because sometimes we just need to chill out.
Yeah, it's funny. In the early days, I was much better at doing that. And then more recently, I was sitting with my stepdaughter, who's 11, and my son, who's 12, who's with his dad sort of part of the time, and they were both talking about these types of yogurts they loved, and I was like, why didn't you tell me? But it's weird because I felt like a massive failure because there are these two humans who are sitting talking about these yogurts that we don't have, and I was thinking, I just put them in the Tesco shop, and it's like so funny, isn't it? Because everyone's so sort of trying, and I don't think there was anything more going on with the kids. I don't think they'd probably even thought, oh, let's ask Katie, she'll probably get us some. But you're right, it is that it comes down to communication again, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. It's all key. And sometimes what we think is not that important, or we think is super important, they don't.
Yeah.
But we're not going to know until we talk to them about it.
Yeah. So I've got a couple more questions, if that's all right, and then I promise I'll let you go. I have to just take everything I can out of the time I've got with you. So going back to dad again, and this is one I hear a lot, and it's a question about jealousy. A lot of the time I hear from women whose stepchildren feel quite jealous of them, jealous of the relationship they have with their dad. They might not openly acknowledge that that's what's going on, but when you sort of unpick it, it is. How can we handle that to better support the children, but also to kind of allow our relationships to function healthily as adults?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and there's always going to be an element of that because they're already having to share their time with their dad already. So they don't necessarily have them. And jealousy is a natural, normal thing to have. They're vying for a limited resource, which is dad's time. So I think part of it is definitely, how is dad stepping up and managing that? So is dad making sure that the children are getting some aspects of some proper time? So we talk about this notion of quality time. All it basically is in those moments, is dad fully engaged with the child on the child's agenda without their head in their to-do list or their work things, them on their phones or being distracted by watching the television? So I think if it's about having those honest conversations with the dad about, right, how can we make sure that when your child is with us, that they feel that they get some proper connection time with you, but that connection time is not the whole time, because children also need to understand and to learn that they need to share. So it's got to start with dad stepping up, having that connection time, and it might be out of the house, it might be in the house. I think it should be a combination of both, because you don't want to sort of feel that actually when I'm in the house I don't get my time with dad at all. But I do think it's about stepping up to that, and also for us to understand that children need that connection time, but they don't need as much of it as we think. It's just the complete and utter presence in that moment. I remember reading Shonda Rhimes, who did that year of saying yes. So she's massive executive. I think she's a producer of Grey's Anatomy and a whole host of other things. But she basically made the decision she was going to have a year of saying yes. So when her daughter, when she's packed up with all of her bags about to leave to go to a big executive meeting, says, "Mummy, can you play with me?" Obviously her head's going like, oh my God, I've got all these million and one things to do. But she took off her bags, she sat down and played. She said literally it was minutes. That's all her child actually wanted, was minutes. But that filled their cup. She did the right thing and then she moved on. So for me, that's always stuck with me, is that that's all our children want. I'm fully present for you. And that's what stepchildren want. They want their dad to be fully present, which, if I'm being gender stereotypes, they often aren't. They often don't get that. So we're already starting on a back foot. But be fully present, but also helping them to be part of that kind of bigger group and sharing. But I would say it has to start with dad.
And what about things like affection? So like I've heard from many women over the course of time that, you know, they'll be sitting down watching a movie and stepdaughter, and it is usually stepdaughter, will want to come in and sort of slice herself right in the middle of them, won't want them to be near each other. Should you kind of think, well, it's important for her to feel included, so stepmum gets up and moves, or I don't need the drama, so stepmum gets up and moves? Or should you actually say, do you know what, it's what you've done's not okay? Or should you, you know, how do you handle that?
I think, and again, for me, it's look at the emotion behind the behaviour. What is she feeling in order to be doing that, rather than, well, that's very rude, she shouldn't be doing that, because there's an emotion that's driving that. Deal with the emotion behind the behaviour, respond to that, and not the behaviour itself. So, for example, has she basically spent most of her life only ever seeing her parents argue? Has she ever actually seen her parents show each other any affection? Is this an uncomfortable thing, and not I don't, she may genuinely have no problem with it, but it makes her feel awkward and weird and she doesn't know how to respond, so instinctively she jumps in? Or is it a jealousy thing? When we really try and tune into, okay, that's interesting, what's the emotion, why, what's driven that, how is she feeling to have done that, I think we respond much better than, well, that's just rude. There can be so many aspects to that are simply not, she just doesn't, it's about me being her stepmom, and she doesn't want me to be affection to her dad. Because I think that's a really, particularly if she's been, if her whole upbringing, she's not seen that demonstrated at home, it might just feel odd and weird, and I don't know what to do with that. So, okay, right, I'm just going to sit there, because that's, rather than saying, Dad, when you cuddle up with your new partner, it makes me feel a bit uncomfortable because I'm not used to seeing that. I don't know what to do about it. Kids don't do that, do they? They just do something.
Yeah, they just react, don't they? It's funny, isn't it? So many of the things that we come up against as step parents aren't always step family issues. They are just family issues or parenting issues. But because you've got that added complex layer of being a step parent, you automatically attribute it to that.
Yeah, completely. I mean, if you started, if you thought about your previous relationships, if you suddenly were, if you weren't naturally massively affectionate, started lots of public displays of affection and all of these sorts of things, your children would be like, oh, mum, dad, why are you doing that? Oh, disgusting. Don't. Yeah. But they feel that they can say that. Stepchildren probably don't feel that they can say, oh, that's disgusting, why are you doing that? So instead they just break it up in whatever way they see. In the same way as when we're feeling anxious and worried, we might lash out at somebody and we're not angry with them, but we're just anxious. I think when we try and constantly think, okay, what's the emotion behind that behavior that's driven that, we can act it from a more compassionate way rather than the sort of, and I think that's not just for stepchildren, I think it's for working with the dynamics of two different households, two different families, biological mum, stepmum, It's just actually trying to do that. But it's quite often so difficult because we react in that real gut-wrenching way of just like, oh.
And a bit like you were talking about earlier, you look for the things around you that reaffirm what you think. So if you think, oh, my stepson doesn't like me, and then your stepson, wants to go and sit next to his dad, you'll automatically think my stepson doesn't like me, but actually it might be because his dad's on the comfier sofa.
Yeah.
Like
it's the best vantage point to watch the film, or maybe they're finding the film a bit scary and they want to cuddle down. It could be a whole host of things.
One final question. It's not unusual for stepchildren to be liberal with the truth. A lot of the time I hear that stepchild has gone home and said something to mum that maybe isn't true. My hunch, and what I hear from my adult friends who were stepchildren, was that they learned pretty early on what to say to mum to make her happy. Of course, this can often come with consequences. So we hear a lot about kind of the Sunday night texts from the weekend stepmums that come about, oh, you've done this wrong, you've done this wrong, you've done that wrong. And a lot of the time it's not even true. How should parents, so dad and stepmum, handle that in terms of wanting to teach a child that it's not okay to lie, but also having empathy with why that child might be doing that?
And I think it's about, if we go back to the whole responding to the emotion behind the behavior, is find moments and opportunities. So you don't, even if you're having the sex talk as a biological parent, I'm not a big fan of, we need to have a conversation about, because I just think it's just a bit big. But what I do think is you've got opportunities to sow seeds, to plant little comments about that just affirms this. Do you know what? I know it can be really difficult sometimes, and that you can feel stuck in the middle. Know that you never need to worry about that, and that I understand that it's just trying to sow those seeds, not to say that you might lie or that it must be difficult going back and blah, 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 but just simply say, do you know what? I get it. I know that it can be really tough to know what to say, and that you can sometimes feel torn, that you have to choose. But know that I'll always love you. We'll always care. We're always here, because then we're trying to gently, slowly put that in, but also know that you can only do your bit at your end. If that child then goes home and for whatever reasons around the narrative in that house feels that they need to affirm somebody else, they will do that, not because they're being malicious or anything else, but because they're stuck. So it's that just trying to constantly affirm that they're loved regardless, and that what a difficult position that sometimes that they might feel that they're placed, but that mum and dad, we both love you, we will always love you, and all we want is for you to be happy. Then you gently, slowly, over time, create, hopefully, less of a need to do that. And it's also then not reacting in that knee-jerk way yourself.
So listen, like so much to take in there and so much helpful advice. I loved the kind of thoughts about like what's the emotion driving that behavior. And it's funny, isn't it, like we always judge ourselves on our intentions, but we judge other people on their actions. So I think that's a really, really good one to think about. And just massive thank you for taking the time to come and talk to us. I really, really, really appreciate it.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, so many great thoughts in that conversation. I cannot thank Dr. Maryhan enough for sharing all of her wisdom and advice. It's super helpful to have someone professional who understands things from all sides on this rollercoaster journey. I was also lucky enough to be invited on the podcast How Not to Screw Up Your Kids, hosted by Dr. Maryhan. So if you want to listen to more of her wisdom on stepmom life, it's episode 61. That's all for this week. Before you get on with your day, if you've enjoyed the show, please do rate or review it on your podcast app. It only takes a second, but it really helps with us getting to other stepmoms. And of course, if you have a story to share, and who doesn't, please do get in touch on Instagram at stepmumspace or through the website www.stepmumspace.com. Thank you.